In the northern province of Sri Lanka, in the Mannar district, on the western coast, is Vidaththaltheevu, an old village where fishing and farming were the main occupations for centuries. It is 300 kilometers north from Colombo, the capital of Sri Lanka. If you take a boat from the Vidaththaltheevu landing site, you can reach this beautiful ecosystem, the Vidaththaltheevu Coral Reef Complex, in 20 minutes and in 7 kilometers. It was a tradition for the villagers here to take their families and friends to the coral reef during the period of January to April, when the sea is calm, with less wind, and the water is crystal clear. Although the villagers knew about this place, it was little known to the outside world. And after the inland conflict in Sri Lanka had ended in the year 2009, people started to slowly recover and get back to fisheries as normal. But this particular ecosystem was still not made visible to the world.
Trying to understand the place, we had our initial observation underwater. What you are seeing now is one of the first ever documented visual on the Vidaththaltheevu Coral Reef Complex. The place looks surreal under the morning sun, colorful fish and mesmerizing coral reef of all kinds.
Our engagement with the old fishers in the village, this ecosystem used to be more rich with fish, including sharks. But now they say that the number of species and the population of fish are all gone low. For example, they said there were lobsters in abundance here 20 years back, but not anymore. So how did this place look 20 years ago? There is no visual evidence, as there were no recorded images of the place, only the eyewitness accounts. We decided to document what is available now, so that we can study the place and get involved in conservation activities for a number of reasons. This coral reef complex is over 2.5 kilometers long and over 1 kilometer wide, roughly. The depth of the sea ranges from 3 to 4 meters. Being in an ambient location for small and big fish to feed and breed, this is one of the main breeding grounds for a number of fish. That means that this complex is one of the main production grounds for the fishery in Mannar district. This reef is not continuous. It has several patches of corals and spaces in between, making it accessible to schools of fish to go in large quantities through the corals.
This is a stranded remaining of a bush that is used to catch cuttlefish. The fishers use a floater and tie the bush with a nylon rope. The cuttlefish choose the bush to lay eggs. And then the fishers either use hooks or nets to catch the cuttlefish. The eggs go unattended. The worst, most of the cuttlefish caught with this method are the egg-laying ones. Meaning, the next generation of cuttlefish is selectively destroyed. And the bushes, the nylon rope and the floater, all stagnate on the corals. Although, not all fishers involved in this method of fishing, there are people who are not controlled or monitored so that they engage in this type of activity on and around the coral reef. One of the reasons for the behavior is the lack of law enforcement, but on the other hand, lack of awareness and responsibility are also causes of this action. As a rich ecosystem, the Vidaththaltheevu Coral Reef Complex attracts schools of economically valuable fish. The result, fishers try to catch them with whatever means possible. Bottom trawling was a huge threat in the past decades. Now, there is not much reported bottom trawling. But, explosive fishing is still a preferred method. This is a Cropper muricata, commonly known as the staghorn coral. And these are Turbonaria mesenterina species commonly known as the disc corals. These are rated as vulnerable by the IUCN.
The delicate corals could be easily broken by wave action and by boats accidentally crashing on the edges of the coral patches. But when explosives are used, there will be a massive impact, and the delicate ones break with the shockwave created by the explosion.
Both species are abundant in the Vidaththaltheevu coral reef complex.
As beautiful as it may look and feel, the fate of the Vidaththaltheevu coral reef complex is not so beautiful. Come, we will walk you through this unheard ecotourism destination that is yet to be conserved, managed and respected for what it is. It is of economic importance to the fishers who live around the coasts. It is of ecological importance to the entire seas of the Mannar district, and the place is under severe threat of destruction. Another abundant species is the Acropora mellifera. Would you imagine that a place like this would be left without much care so that it could be literally destroyed? This particular spot at the edge of the coral reef has been damaged, possibly by boats landing on the edges. This one is Acropora lutkini. It is not only just corals. There are a lot of sponges and others that bring the colorful combination. Where the corals have dead by natural or man-made causes, other species of stationary organisms have moved in. It is a pleasing sight to see layers of corals and the moving creatures in the blue background of the sea water. Since the Vidaththaltheevu coral reef complex is not a continuous one, there are trench-like structures in between the patches. These are not really trenches, but the adjacent coral patches make these spaces look like trenches. There were some corals that were broken here and there. Some looked like as if they are dead. When there is high tide, the water above the coral reef is deep enough for boats to go over the corals. It might have been the reason why corals have broken down. Bleaching is another cause of death. During August, in low tide, the corals are exposed to the air and sun, causing them to bleach. So, most of the damaged sites we observed were at the edges of the coral patches, where the trenches were easy to access from the boats, and to use dynamite and other explosives to kill fish. It is also easier to collect the dead fish from the trenches, rather than on the coral reef. But damaging the edges of the corals with explosion prevents the corals from growing and expanding. The trenches in between the coral patches are where the fish move in large schools. This makes the trenches vulnerable to dynamite fishing. Fishers who practice this illegal method cause unspeakable damage to the corals. This is where educating the fishing community becomes important. All fishers know that the corals are growing. But how many of them know the magnitude of time it takes for the corals to grow or regrow? In our experience, not many fishers are aware of this. The fastest growing corals can grow up to 20 centimeters a year. The slowest growing corals grow only up to 2.5 centimeters a year. While the fishers of the Vidaththaltheevu village are aware and agree that the corals are an important resource to conserve, and that the corals have value to be conserved, they really don't know how high these resources are valued by people around the world. It is only researchers like us or tourists who point out the importance to the villagers. And they are excited to see how other people value the resources that the village has had for centuries. This excitement can be curated. This is another example of a dynamite blast site in the past. The corals have started to take over. However, the damage brings the corals decades back in growth, and make the patches vulnerable to cope up with the environment. Here is an abandoned fishing net that has entangled into the corals. Removing it requires skill and care. More than that, it poses threat to this ecosystem. There are dead and broken corals. They might have been subject to bleaching, boating, or even fishing activities. This one with the plate-like structures is the Mantipora capricornis. Corals around the world are being conserved for their environmental value. Here, in the Vidaththaltheevu coral reef complex, conservation can be an easy endeavor if handled properly. Since the fishers of the village gain the most benefit from these corals, they could be motivated to conserve these corals. It would require massive effort to motivate the people. Once motivated, people could be trained to manage the corals. Is it not saddening to see the beautiful corals where you have to witness the mindless destruction caused either by ignorance or by lack of knowledge? As we observed, there are many corals in patches, together in concentrated populations. But there are corals in the trenches, or outside the patches as well. Types of different brain corals and ball corals were seen to exist solo, or with one or two other corals. This coral looking like a ball is Madrepora rotulosa. The black damsel is one of the frequently sighted fish in this part of the coral. The yellow one in this scene is the Pocillopora grandis. The one with the white tips is the Acropora polystoma. And this is again the damages from the past and the corals taking over. And this large one is Dipsastria speciosa, formerly known as Favia speciosa. The extensive damage caused by human activities is alarming. One promising thing is that no one is taking away the corals for any income purpose. It was common for the visitors to the corals to break and bring some of them for their beauty. But that activity has decreased now. We have to think of ways to conserve the corals here. Apart from the bleaching of the corals that show above the water during the dry months, typically from June to August, there don't seem to be any natural threats. Since this was our first attempt to survey the reef, we are still in the process of postulating a few actions for conservation. As we went on observing the corals, one thing was clear. We could not see many commercially valuable fish, apart from the fish with ornamental value. Maybe, like the elders in the village said, the different species of fish caught for food might have gone less in numbers. Since the corals are disturbed by explosions, the schools of fish may visit less frequently. Either way, the fact is, the fish population has gone low. The village elders also said that one of the abundant types was the parrotfish. They said if they wanted to catch a parrotfish, they would simply go to the Vidaththaltheevu coral reef complex, look for one, and catch it. It used to be that abundant. Since the economic value of the parrotfish increased, it has been overfished and overexploited. In our entire initial survey, we could not cite a single parrotfish or a lobster. There is much to see from the surface of the water. Snorkeling is a potential ecotourism activity. If boats with glass floors are deployed, people can also watch the corals from the boats. In the middle of all these destructive activities in the past, it seems like the diversity of the corals has not been lost yet. We cannot simply compare from the past because there is no catalog or documented evidence from the past. But the village elders told us that this Vidaththaltheevu coral reef complex used to be much colorful and with diverse species. It looks like the corals have been struggling, but are coping up. In the edges of the corals, that is, in the trenches, we observed parts of corals that have broken down from the edges. And the reason why there were standalone corals in the trenches might be that the broken corals fell onto the sides, assisted by the wave and water current to move to the new locations, and started growing again. It's only a speculation. We are yet to investigate this thoroughly. This green one is Acropora humilis. We also noticed bivalves of different types in the corals where the corals have died. They seem to have clinked onto the hard surfaces of the corals. We did not observe any bivalve binding onto live corals. It might have been an adaptation of these bivalves caused by the destruction of corals to somehow create a space for themselves among the grant corals. We observed different fish on the floor as well. Among them, burrower fish on the ground was common. We also noticed other fish that are shy to show up and kept going under the roof of Acropora corals. While the corals exposed to extreme heat have bleached and dead, they seem to continuously regenerate. It was evident that it was not only the natural causes that have damaged the corals. It is very clear that the destruction was caused by humans. Corals at the edges of the coral patches were the most damaged. Feather duster worms, like this one, add to the scenic beauty as well. The village, Vidaththaltheevu, is the closest to these corals. It is a village with a harbor and fishers. However, the coral is accessible to over tens of thousands of fishers from the northern part of Sri Lanka. So the safety measures or security checks done at the Vidaththaltheevu village will not restrict access to the corals. Fishers from other places have been reported to use explosives at the corals for decades. It is not only the Vidaththaltheevu coral reef complex, but many others. So, limiting access from the Vidaththaltheevu landing site is not the solution. Maybe granting access from the Vidaththaltheevu landing site for ecotourism can create more awareness and responsibility. The fishers of the village, Vidaththaltheevu, have extensive knowledge of these corals for generations. If they become the tourist guides for an ecotourism at these corals, they will feel the responsibility to safeguard their resources, because it will also generate income for them. But why ecotourism? Because these corals will have to be actively guarded from the dynamite fishing and any other form of fishing directly on the corals. Laws and rules alone will not save these corals. In fact, laws are already there, but they cannot be enforced at all times. The locals have to be aware of their resources and any intruders have to be stopped. One solution is to keep the corals visited regularly and monitored actively. When people are present, the illegal activities will stop. If a boundary was set up around the Vidaththaltheevu coral reef complex and fishing activities are completely prohibited inside the boundary, then the fish population will also increase. It will directly benefit the fishing communities along the coast, because they are the ones who will receive more fish. So, if the impacts caused by the proper management and conservation of corals are clear to the local fishers, then they will take the responsibility. But to do all of these, documentation like this one has to be done. We intend to survey the complex thoroughly and catalog the species and monitor the growth and damages of the corals. When the outside world and the fishers see a documented evidence and understand the benefits of the proper management of the corals, they will voluntarily involve in the conservation. Sighting a lobster moving, a parrotfish grazing on the corals, or a stonefish in ambush will be an easing experience in the corals. Watching a lionfish from above the corals is something not all of us might have had. It is all possible if the place is managed properly. After all, it is the natural resources like this one that keep humanity moving. We are happy that the Vidaththaltheevu Fishermen Cooperative Society, VFCS, has given us extended support in learning, documenting, and to initiate ecotourism and conservation efforts. The fishers in the Vidaththaltheevu village are also eager to conserve their resources. There are young fishers trained as site guides. With training, these young fishers can start as ecotourism guides on the Vidaththaltheevu coral reef complex. They will earn money and become voluntary guardians of corals. When the ecotourism is set up responsibly, the members of the ecotourism society from the same village can be involved in the conservation activities. Hiring the same people for cleaning and other activities related to conservation will educate them more about the corals. It is not just the stony beauties. There is a lot about this ecosystem that these people need to learn before they can actively and passionately connect themselves with these corals. These are not university students, and we cannot expect them to voluntarily study about the corals and involve in conservation. These people are daily earning fishers. When they see these corals as one of their income sources, they will automatically start connecting with these corals. Rather than leaving these corals abandoned, it is better to create an income channel to a few youngsters, and then train them in the conservation process as well. Again, when we inquired the village elders, they said that the boxfish was also abundant. They still get boxfishes in their fishing nets, but not as abundant as they used to be. Even in the locations where the corals seemed like they were not affected, there still was damage. When we looked in between good-looking corals, there is always some broken, damaged, and dead ones. We think the fate of this beautiful ecosystem can be changed into a dry one. Although there is a lot like this cloned fish, people outside the fishing community in this village don't know that these features exist here. The location is only 7 kilometers from the Vidaththaltheevu landing site and takes only 20 minutes to reach. We are actively seeking permission to start ecotourism in this location. Once the ecotourism begins, we are planning to install cameras for monitoring the area for illegal and destructive activities. We plan to coordinate with the IUCN and others. But it is a long way to go. Our intention was to document this place and make it known to the world first. This is the first ever video documentary with underwater footage on the Vidaththaltheevu coral reef complex. And we are happy that we were able to bring this unknown world out to you. It was a satisfying journey to have documented this place. We are leaving the Vidaththaltheevu coral reef complex for today, only to continue to document the full facility and to bring these corals and the people here a new life. We will continue to explore and conserve this beautiful and useful coral reef complex. We have plans to clean up the broken and dead corals and to use them as substratum to grow new patches of corals. We will continue to research, work, and passionately connect here.